Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be dialing in from. So welcome to the Design Control Workshop. I am Melita Ball, the founder and principal consultant for MBCA. And here's my email and my website address. But instead of doing a lengthy introduction today, I've decided just to put the QR code there that will actually link to my bio. If you want to take your phone and just point the camera at that QR code, it should bring up a link that you can learn more about me if you don't already know me. I see some friendly faces out there already. We are a fairly large group today, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time. We have a lot of stuff to go through. So let's go ahead and dive in and get started. So the first thing we want to talk about is the logistics. So logistics today, we want to make sure that everyone is comfortable with the recording. We are recording today, and if you do not want to be recorded, please keep your video off. And we're going to ask everyone already to stay on mute for the presentation because due to the length of the presentation, we cannot really have a live Q&A. We'll probably go right up to time. But instead, we're going to ask you to use the chat function to submit all your questions. Amanda, my co-host, will be grabbing those and pulling those down for me so I can respond to every single question that gets asked in the chat today. And everyone that is a participant in today's presentation will get that FAQ or all the answers to your questions in an email following this presentation. It'll probably go out tomorrow. So having said that, let's go ahead and dive into the content. So what are we trying to accomplish today? What are we trying to learn? This presentation is really all about learning or understanding the baseline regulatory requirements for design control. And this goes not just for the US, but for Europe as well. And then to learn how those regulatory requirements fit into the overall development process. So you have two different things going on here. You have your normal development process, and you also have the regulatory requirements that you're required to meet on top of that. So we're going to blend those two together and show you how they work together. So I'm going to start by just giving you an overview or a big picture view of the quality system. So these are the 7 subsystems of quality. Probably most of you have already seen this at some point in your life. And just to orient you where we are actually focused directly into design controls today. So that's what we're going to be talking about. I always like to start off with a few definitions just to baseline everyone, and then we'll kind of come back and go more in depth to each one of those areas. So the first thing we want to talk about in design control is the core team. This is a critical function in design control. You need to make sure that this core team is solid, that they understand what they need to do. And it is a cross-functional team, and they will have the overall responsibility for development and market introduction of new product or significant design changes. If you have to go back through the design control process, that's where they are going to be critical. The core team is identified in the project plan, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. The design and development plan is a critical piece in this entire process. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that works and what gets included in that project plan itself. Then critically, there needs to be a project lead. This would be the leader of the core team and would lead the project from beginning to end. It's usually a design engineer or a quality engineer, and they will be responsible for coordinating all of the design and development activities in addition to any risk management activities, or if you have software development activities as well. They're kind of the point person for everything that's happening for that particular design. That person must have sufficient knowledge, experience, and training in design control requirements and in development activities. So you want someone who understands the requirements, understands the regulations, so that they can effectively lead the organization through that process. These are acronyms that have been around for years and years, and they always get confused for some reason. So I'm going to do my best to square off on these and kind of separate them so you can get a better understanding of what they mean. The DHF, it stands for Design History File, and it is really not just one file. It's a file, but it's a compilation of a whole bunch of records that describe the entire history of the design of a finished device. Conversely, the device master record is a smaller record that actually is a compilation of everything it takes to make that device. So everything that contains procedure specifications, drawings, everything that will be included in your finished device. The next thing we're going to talk about is user needs, design inputs, and design outputs. And this slide is really just designed to define them, to define the differences between the three, but we'll go into that in a little more depth when we get to that point in the presentation. So user needs, what is a user need? These are requirements for the device that are expressed from the user's point of view. This is really important because these are not technical descriptions, these are not technical specs. Those user needs will then form the basis for your design inputs, which are more technical. So user needs can be things like, oh, it must be portable. That's not really measurable, but it's a user need that the team will take and then define that in greater detail. So with that one need, you can come out with 4 or 5 different design inputs to meet that need. So one to many, oftentimes it's a one to many relationship between a user need and a design input. So design input, it's the physical and performance requirements of a device that are used as the basis for the device design. So these are all of the technical components that it must meet, all of the specifications, and each one of these needs to then map back up to a user need. It's important to understand too that user needs can be regulatory requirements. They don't actually necessarily have to be completely expressed by the user. You want to make sure that you're covering everything that's required, like say electrical safety, if you have an electrical device, those kinds of things. You would also put them into a user need because obviously, even if users don't tell you, they don't want to get electrocuted, right? So those are all part of the user needs, and then you would design your inputs from that. And design output is simply the result of that design effort to meet that design input. So that design output can be a physical component, it can be a drawing, it can be a lot of different things with specifications and tolerances you would actually design into the product. Design reviews. Yes, design reviews are required, and the regulators clearly define what they mean by design review. And not every meeting that you have with the technical team is considered a design review. So it's really important to understand what is considered a design review, when they should happen, how they're defined. So to start off with, it needs to be a comprehensive, systematic examination of a design to evaluate the adequacy of that design to meet the requirements and to identify any problems. So if you're just having, say if you have a software device and you just have a code review, that's a code review. That is not a design review. A design review needs to take into account every part of the design, including risk management, including components, all the accessories, and sometimes even suppliers. So all of that needs to be comprehensive and it needs to be systematic, which means it needs to be defined into your project plan when those design reviews are going to happen. It also is important to understand that folks will need to be involved in that it's not just a 1-2 person meeting. That is, the core team certainly should be there. It's usually led by the project lead and any kind of subject matter experts, including outsourced consultants or outsourced subject matter experts that need to be part of that team, should all be part of the design review process. Design verification. I separate these out on purpose. Many companies will try to lump design verification and design validation together, but quite honestly, they're extremely different. They have different goals, they have different components, and they should be done at different times. So for this presentation, I want to make sure we cover design verification first. And then we can dive in to more of the design validation efforts. So what is the definition of design verification? It's a confirmation by examination and provision of objective evidence that specified design outputs conform to and adequately meet the corresponding design inputs. So in a nutshell, you have your user need, which drives your design input. You have your design input that comes together in a design output, and then you have to test it. You have to test the design output to make sure that it conforms to what you originally set out to do. Those are individual. One thing important about design verification, it doesn't tell you that the design or the product actually works for the patient or the user. It doesn't tell you that it meets its intended use. It's simply the components that you've drawn up have met their requirements. That's all you're trying to do at that stage. Design validation, however, is different in that it establishes objective evidence that the device actually works and it conforms with the overall user needs that started the process in the first place and its intended use. And that does mean that the product needs to work and it needs to be effective in whatever it's supposed to be doing. Last but not least, design transfer. So design transfer is really the culmination of all of the efforts during which the product and process designs are transferred to production or manufacturing. Once everything is ready to go and you're ready to actually transfer all of that into a production environment, then there is a design checklist that needs to happen, a design transfer checklist that needs to happen to make sure that everything is done before it goes over to being scaled up and can be produced on a larger scale. So let's talk about the elements of design control. Now, I just went through a whole bunch of definitions. And if you were paying really close attention and keeping count, there are seven. There are seven required elements of design control. And those are things that you must build into your development process. So we started with user needs, and then we talked about design inputs and design outputs. Then you have to build in design reviews throughout the process. And then design verification, design validation, and finally transfer, where you get the culmination of the product to be able to meet the user need. So now let's switch gears and talk about the development process itself. So how do you incorporate these design control elements into your overall development process? While there are many development processes out there that you can choose, I'm going to cover the waterfall model today because it's probably the simplest, and it's also the one that we really recommend. If you're a startup, you're just getting started, it's the easiest one to follow. It's the easiest one to make sure that you're getting all of your documentation that you need to prove your device and to get it to market. So you kind of look at this in the life cycle of a device. It starts with really a concept. And sometimes there's feasibility studies and there's, breadboards or prototypes and, all of this research that's being done. That is not part of design control, believe it or not. So that piece can be done outside of the formal process of design control. However, anything you produce there, it's important that you include it as part of your design history file as evidence that you did your due diligence and research as inputs to the full design control process. So when you get into design control itself, then you have a design and development phase, and then you have a transfer and production phase. Then once you transfer it into production, the full life cycle of the device is when you're monitoring and continuously improving the device over time and after the production cycle hits. So you want to have design reviews built in. This graphic isn't quite accurate because the DR4 should be a little bit closer to the blue phase. These DRs represent the design reviews. Typically, most companies will build in 3 or 4 design reviews. Some, if it's very complex, may have a 5th design review process. And then all of these interim reviews, the things that don't qualify as a design review, but nonetheless are extremely important to pushing your device forward, will be considered what we call interim reviews. Okay, so you have this whole process. And how does everything really fit in? This diagram has been around a long time. I still use it because I still think it visually represents a really good concept of how it all works together. So if you have your design process, you start with your user needs, which then outputs to your inputs, and then you design the product. Then you have your outputs. Then you verify your outputs against your inputs. And that eventually you will lead to a medical device that you can actually validate in the market, which will tie back up to your user needs. And in the process, you will have design reviews built in for each one of these phases. And obviously, there's documentation that gets output for every single one of these stages of the process. Let's talk about design planning. It's the first stage or the first phase of design control is really you have to plan out your design. So what does that mean? The first thing you want to have is something that we call a DDP, a design and development plan. It gives you the overall plan for the design project. It describes the development requirements for the product. So, because it depending on your product, you may have more or less requirements that you have to meet based on the complexity and the risk of your device. So the first thing you want to do is identify the prerequisite information to start each activity. So what do you need to move from one stage to the next stage? Do you need to have all of user needs documented before you can move on to the next stage, which is creating your specs? Assumptions made during the development of the DDP. So here's some of the assumptions that you might make. You may have information in the market. You may have done research that for similar devices. So you may have some assumptions coming in. Those all should be documented as part of your design and development plan. Interrelationships between functions and activities. This is critical, especially if you're outsourcing some of this. Say if you're outsourcing, if you have a device that has software or you're working on an SAMD, those functions that you're outsourcing to, say, a software developer, things like that, those all need to be defined and well established in your DDP so that you can see who is taking care of what and how those interactions will happen. Responsible resources for implementation, your project schedule, and your project budget. Design and development is not cheap. And most of you probably already know that if you're already working in medical device, or if you're just getting started and you're thinking about going through this process as an entrepreneur and really getting a device to the market, then you will see that in this regulated industry, it is not a cheap endeavor to get a product to the market. So you want to make sure that you have a realistic budget, that you plan for that, and you get funded for that, especially if you need clinical trial work or anything like that. So all of that, really think of the design and development plan as your master plan for how you're going to develop the product and what requirements are going to be needed. This design and development plan needs to be formally approved and kept up to date. The design history file doesn't just mean you have to have one version of the DDP. It's a living document. It's expected to be a living document. So from the time you start to the time you end, you should be on lots of different revs because you change. Sometimes that initial DDP, you don't have information. So you may have huge sections that just have TBD on them at that first rev, and that is okay. It is a living document throughout the process, and it will grow with the design and the team. The other thing is that the core team needs to be trained on the DDP. They need to know the direction that they're going. They need to know the target that they're shooting for. So making sure that they are reading and understanding at least the design and development plan is pretty important. And then if any changes happen, usually those changes are going to happen because they come up during design review. They're going to go, oh yeah, we need to go back and make an update to the design and development plan. And that becomes a more of an iterative process. So that DDP needs to stay up to date. And every time the core team should be involved and retrained on that so that everyone knows the direction. As part of the planning for design and development, you also need to have a regulatory plan. In this industry, without a regulatory plan, you have a 50 times you're more likely to fail, or you're more likely to delay kind of getting to market if you don't have a clearly worked out regulatory plan as part of this planning process. So things you want to think about: where am I going to market the device? What's the classification device? And what's the classification in the market that I want to go to? So it might not just be the US, it could be EU, it could be Canada, it could be Brazil, Japan, Australia. Those are the huge markets for medical device right now. So you want to have that regulatory strategy built out for your 1, 3, and 5 year plan. Maybe you don't want to go to multiple markets at the same time, and that's actually a very smart decision. But maybe you want to get traction in one country or traction in one market before moving to the next one. So all of that will depend on timing of your timeline. It will also depend on your funding, how much funding you have and how many resources you have available. Obviously, the more resources, the faster you can get to market. And that strategy should be well thought out. So it's very closely tied to marketing. And I know if I have some quality professionals listening today, it's also this whole thing of, oh, marketing and regulatory, we really don't usually get along very well, but it really is important that regulatory and marketing is closely aligned on what you're trying to do with that device. Also, submission requirements. Clearly, if you're a class 1 device in the United States, that's a very different pathway than a 510(k), which is also a very different pathway than a de novo or a PMA if it's a class 3 device. Okay, so making sure that you understand what those submission requirements are, you understand the timelines, you understand your budget for regulatory planning. Then comes the biggie these days, risk management. Under 14971, 2019, which is also required in the US, by the way, through the consensus standards list from the FDA, it's a daunting list of things that you have to do. It is a daunting group of activities that need to happen for every medical device. So the risk management plan should go hand in hand in this whole design planning. So we recommend that there's always 3 plans. Minimally, there's always 3 plans. And if you have software, you have a software development plan on top of that. So you actually have 4. Risk management, though, why do we need a risk management plan? What's included? So these are all the things that you need to have inside that risk management plan. So you need to clearly define the risk management scope. What's the scope of your device? It's per device or per device family. You need to define what that risk category is overall. You need to specify the roles and responsibilities and authorities within the risk management process. Who's in charge? Who's doing the FMEAs? Who's doing the DFMEAs? How is all this coming together? And make sure those are resourced. You need to establish the criteria for risk acceptability, and that should align with your risk acceptability policy that needs to be placed in either your quality manual or a policy document. The risk management plan will outline the specific risk management activities for the life cycle of the device. Now, remember, risk management is not just for design. It's for the entire life cycle of the product. So it needs to go further than design, all the way to what you anticipate as the sunset for the product. You must specify the methods and the tools that will be used for risk management. What kind of tools are you going to use? Are you going to use an FMEA process? That's the typical process. And there's a DFMEA and a PFMEA, and there's all kinds of things that you need to put in place to make sure that you're utilizing those tools. Then you need to describe the verification activities that are going to be used as part of risk management, describing the contents of the risk management report. So there's a plan that's required and also a report at the end of every risk management cycle. So you need to make sure you're identifying what's going to be in the report, what can you expect to see as far as risk goes. Then you'll need to describe the structure and the content of the risk management file. This is typically pretty standard, but it could alter one way or another depending on the complexity of your device. If you have a very simple device, you may have a smaller risk management file, less things in it than if you have a very complex device or a system that you're creating. It's not just one device, but it's a whole system that you're trying to get approval or clearance for. Ongoing risk reviews and monitoring. What's going to trigger after design? What's going to trigger a review of your risk management plan? What's going to trigger a review of your risk tables to make sure that you're identifying ongoing risks as you're moving through this whole production area or the monitoring part of the life cycle. Last but not least, how is post-production information going to be integrated into the risk management process? Now, once you get through design and you move into production, you will have all of those other quality system elements, or you should have, if you're developing your quality system correctly, you should have all of those other elements in place to help you monitor the product in the field. Things like complaint handling and corrective and preventive action and nonconformance reporting and post-market surveillance. And there's all kinds of things that you need to have in place to actually monitor those. And it's required that you put that in the risk management plan. How are you going to monitor risk in the field once you've gotten the product into the field? So there's a lot to be said about risk management. So that leads me to my next QR code for you guys. So get your phones out. You can sign up for the next workshop, which is all about risk management. You can register now by pointing your camera at the QR code below, and then you can save the date, register for the course now. There are limited of spaces available. So that will be 2 weeks from today, Thursday, February 29th at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. So hopefully I've given you all a chance to point your cameras and use the QR code. If you're not able to do that, if you check the chat, Amanda is putting the link to register in the chat as well. And all of these QR links will be put in the chat if you missed it by pointing your camera. So let's move into design reviews. What are design reviews? Let's get into a little bit more detail of how all the design reviews work together. So again, like I said, design review is a formal process. It's focused on the technical evaluation assessment of conformity to all the specs. So you're looking at each section of the design. And because the design reviews are scheduled throughout the product development cycle, design reviews look a little bit different depending on what cycle you're in, what area you're in. If you are doing a planning review, you really don't have a lot of technical stuff to review, but what you're doing is reviewing all those plans that we just talked about, the regulatory plan, the risk management plan, the design and development plan. And if you have software, which most of you probably do these days, unless you're implantable, and even now implantables have electronic or software with them as well, then you would need a software development plan as well. So the first design review is really all about looking at those plans. You're not looking at any you're not technical information, you're not looking at any results of testing or anything like that, but still it's a critical review. The next design review, you may be looking at design verification activities. You may be looking at protocols. You may be looking at outputs of those protocols. So there's a lot of things that you can focus on that are different in every single design review. The other thing I want to talk about is the accumulation in design review. So once you have the first design review, you go to the second design review, which you're diving into a little more technical information. So you have a more technical review in that second stage. However, you shouldn't neglect what you've already reviewed. For instance, if you have a planning review and you're going to review all of the plans, the risk management plan, the design and development plan, and the regulatory plan, then the next review, you should look at all the technical specs, but you should also take a quick look back to say, are there any things in the plans that need to change? Do we need to look at those as well? So include those into the design review. And as you move through the design reviews, they get bigger and bigger and bigger because you're always taking a look back and asking yourself, has anything changed significantly that we need to account for in this design process? So you're making sure as you get to the more technical pieces, you're verifying that the design is compatible with the materials. You could be in the middle of clinical trials. You could have some of that information coming back in. If you have that safety, reliability requirements, you could have your product at this point outsourced to a 60601 testing lab. So it's doing electrical testing. So you may have some of those results coming back in to review. Your software development team may be working on software development and they have some things to share with the team. So all of this becomes part of the design review process. It's the chance for the whole core team to get together and any ancillary subject matter experts that are needed, and making sure that you're driving to the end of the design in the way that you need to in a very efficient manner. Now, a lot of people say, well, that's a lot of paperwork. It's a lot of stuff to do. Yes, it is. But if you do it in conjunction, if you have design control in place when you start designing, it not only saves you time, it saves you effort, it saves you a lot of money, and it actually streamlines your time to market. If you're trying to just design stuff without any of the structure in place, you're likely not going to get to the market in the timeline that you wanted. You're also probably not going to get there within the budget that you want, because you're going to have to redo and rework and remediate a lot of the stuff that you do by not following this process in the first place. So it's really important to get this process in place early as you possibly can. Make sure you're completing everything along the way as you're moving through the design. So again, I think I've talked about this a little bit, but it does provide a forum for the reviewers to evaluate, to identify potential concerns. But let's talk about this other piece. It's also a chance for the core team to challenge assumptions, challenge the design. So you should at least have one or more people in that group who their job is to challenge the assumptions or challenge the design to make the design more robust. They can oftentimes, by that critical kind of perspective, you can also make the design a whole lot better so it becomes stable in the field much faster. And if you can get stability in the field in this market, then you're going to reduce your regulatory burden. You're going to reduce your risk in the market for this device, and you're also going to reduce how many complaints you have to handle and how many things you have to investigate. It just makes the whole process so much easier if you build in a lot of this critical looking at yourself. You're looking at your own design, challenging your assumptions, and making sure you commit to that. You're going to reap the benefits when your product actually gets to market. So what are the results? Once the design review is done, then you need to document when the design occurred, who was there, what functions they had. You need to produce meeting minutes so that you have evidence that you did the design reviews appropriately per your plan. And and it will give you all of the talking points. If there are decisions that are made, then those decisions should be documented. If there are action items coming out of that, which oftentimes there are, then those action items can then be tracked and trended to make sure that you're going back and making an update to the design and development plan, for instance, or you need to make an update to risk tables because you found a new hazard that you didn't know about before. Those kinds of things are all important to document as you move through this process. Because remember, the output of the design reviews becomes part of your DHF or your design history file. And that is what gets inspected and reviewed during audits and inspections from regulatory bodies. So what do these meeting minutes look like? So here's a checklist for you. If you want to take a picture of this, you can and you're going to get a copy of this presentation at the end anyway. So the completed design review documentation should look like this. You should have a clear date when the review happened. The agenda, what was on the agenda for that particular meeting? Like I said, remember, design review agendas can change throughout the life of the design or the development process. What type of a review is it? What are you looking at? What are the elements that you're looking at? Is it just a planning review, or is it a verification review, or is it a validation review, or is it a clinical trial review? What kind of review is it that you're trying to conduct? Remember, it always has to be comprehensive. It always has to cover everything in your design, but the scope may just be focused on certain elements of that. So action items, things that are coming out of that meeting, need to be identified and tracked throughout the process so that you're making sure that you're delivering and you're getting everything done that needs to be done. Record of attendees with signatures. Yes, you have to have signatures. So those of you who have electronic quality management systems, good for you, because these are easy to get captured in that system as an electronic signature. Otherwise, you're back to paper and having to file that and PDF it and attaching it to things. So really recommend that you guys think about electronic quality management systems today, because they are becoming the necessity. A lot of times small startups didn't have those systems. Early on, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they started on paper and then migrated to an EQMS at some point once they're mature. And now the EQMS systems are so affordable, they're so easy to set up, that really recommend you get that so that you can take advantage of that electronic signature piece. At least one independent reviewer. Remember, that person or those people that are there to challenge the design. Not only is it an FDA requirement, it's really a good business practice from a design perspective, because you want to make sure that you're putting out the best design that you possibly can, and also to alleviate problems downstream in the field. So if someone can kind of anticipate what the user or the patient may experience using your device and kind of get in front of that, you're always going to have a better advantage in terms of the market by being able to have thought about that beforehand rather than waiting till the device gets to the market. Review assessment. So any kinds of assessments that you're done, you want to make sure that you are summarizing everything that design review covered and any conclusions that you may have, and any follow-up activities, including corrective actions. If you have a corrective action that's coming out, then you may want to already start using your corrective action system to document that and to methodically work through all of those steps. So in process. So what are in process technical reviews? So those are reviews that can be conducted as frequently as you want. They do not require the level of documentation as formal design reviews. However, it's a good business practice to make sure that you're doing some kind of documentation if, for instance, you have a significant aha moment or you have a significant suggestion that will change the design that you would take to the next design review. So those things should be documented as just part of the good documentation practices that you have. However, it does not require the level of attendees and signatures and formality that a true design review does. If the technical review results in a change to the approved design, then you should follow a design change process for that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that a little bit later. Sometimes in this design process, depending on where you are, the development process, depending on where you are, you may need to create a change control from that. But most of the time, because you're not on the market yet, you can handle most of those changes through documentation changes. And that's a much smaller ask in terms of what you need to do. Now, once you transfer to production, then you're completely in a change control environment. And you need to have everything change controlled. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. So let's recap on the design history file. So the project lead ensures the output of every phase is documented and filed in the DHF. And it's also important to realize that the DHF isn't just about that, it's about every single piece of documentation that you create during the development process, including all of the revisions to your planning documents. So if you start with a version 1 or a Rev A with your design and development plan, you could end up at the end of this or at the design history file, you could end up with 12, 15 different renditions of that document. And guess what? Every single one of them needs to be included as part of the DHF. So it is your design history file. It is the file that tells you the entire history of how you designed and developed the product. So every one of those revisions needs to be included. Same thing for your risk management plan, same thing for software development. Anything that you document as part of this process becomes part of that eventual DHF. And regulators do ask for it. In fact, when they get to this subsystem in design control, one of the first things they might ask you for is your entire DHF for product X or whatever product they're choosing. And that means they want it all. They want everything in front of them so they can then sample based on what they see. DHFs can be extremely large. Back in the old days, I remember when I was back in industry, I remember this one inspection where the FDA inspectors came in and they said, I'd like to see your DHF for XYZ. And we literally had to get carts to roll the boxes in because it was all on paper. Today is so much better, so much easier that everything is electronic, or it should be, and you can call it up on screen and they can review all of those things electronically. They're easy to print out sections that they need without having to wheel in your entire design history file, because these things can get very, very lengthy. Okay, so what do I mean by records? So like I said at the beginning, anything that you do in the concept and feasibility stage, while it's not formally part of design control, you should still include that information to show kind of the continuity of how you got to where you got, and how you came up with the idea is always a really good thing to document as part of your DHF. Any kind of your planning deliverables, like I said, the DDP, the risk management plan, the regulatory plan, your software development plan, all of those planning documents that you do at the very beginning should be included in the DHF, and all of the versions along the way. All of your design and development inputs and your outputs and your user needs. So the user needs, oftentimes the user needs are at least drafted in the concept and feasibility stage because you're collecting all of the information as you're going through. But certainly by the time you get to the design input phase, you want to formalize all of those user needs and correlate them to your inputs, and then correlate your inputs to your outputs. So then you can have this, what we call a traceability matrix, that gives a bird's eye view of your entire design. Any risk management deliverables need to be put in there, whether you do DFMEAs or, product risk assessments. All of the things that you will perform as part of risk will be part of your design history file. Any kind of verification deliverables. When you're doing that verification or design verification, remember, you're going to create a protocol. And you're going to say, this is what we're going to do. And you're going to create line by line test scripts, if you will, on how you're going to identify that your outputs actually met your input requirements. All of that outcome and the reports, the protocol reports that are written based on that need to be part of your DHF. Design validation deliverables. A lot of times you can get into the mix of clinical trial work. So clinical trial outcomes, things like that. If you met your clinical endpoints, all of that should be included as part of your design validation. If you don't need clinical studies, you can also build in as part of your design validation kind of simulated use testing. So if your device is being used by healthcare professionals, you may want to set up your design validation protocol so that you have healthcare professionals coming into a site and actually using the device and providing and getting that feedback, ensuring that they can use the device safely and effectively. That's a great way to kind of blend in not only your design validation deliverables, but also some usability study in that as well. You can make sure that it's used properly. If your device is an over-the-counter device and you can recruit people to come in and actually use your device and make sure that they can follow all the instructions, at least in a simulated way. Just follow all of your instructions and get through all of the use cases there. Design transfer deliverables. Not only should you have a fully blown out transfer checklist, every single thing you need to do to make sure that everything is in place when you move over to production, that's included as part of the DHF. Any kind of post-market surveillance plans that you have, are you going to focus on this device? And you should in the marketplace when you first release it. How long is that going to happen? How long are you going to have a heightened awareness around that device until that device becomes what we call stable in the field, right? So you want to have a post-market surveillance plan that covers all of those elements when you first release the device to the market. You're going to learn things that you may not have anticipated. You're going to get feedback. You're going to get information. You want to be able to be spot on that and have a plan to be able to handle all of that feedback so that you can then improve your device. Okay, and stay on top of it. Once it gets stabilized in the field, everything kind of dies down. You kind of know the performance characteristics of your device. You don't have to have such a heightened awareness. But until then, you should have a post-market surveillance plan that focuses on how you're going to monitor at a heightened awareness for a period of time in the market. Any kind of design change documentation. So if you have changes to the design that you actually put through a design change process, then you can include that. Obviously any of the revs and any of the rationales for why you're making those changes to the document should be included as well. You also need to develop a device master record as part of the deliverables and the design review documentation, certainly, and all the team meeting minutes along the way. All right, so I call the device master record the recipe. It's everything you need to make the device. So someone should be able to take your device master record and then produce your device in its entirety. So things like device specifications, drawings, raw material specs, component specs, any kind of production and process specifications, equipment, production methods, quality assurance procedures, packaging, labeling, installation and maintenance procedures and methods if your device needs to be installed or it needs to be maintained. Planning should begin early and often for design transfer. Don't wait until design transfer is upon you to then think about design transfer. So the earlier you can get in front of that, creating those design transfer plans and those checklists, the better off you're going to be. All right. After this, you have scale up. We have about 8 minutes left, so I think I'm doing okay. Scale up. On design transfer, you want to make sure that all your manufacturing, QC, QA, drawings, everything is in its final form and it's released through change control. All personnel should be trained to everything that they need to do. And the core team, the design core team, starts working with manufacturing to troubleshoot issues. Sometimes the way the product is designed may have a too tight of a spec or it needs to be loosened up, or maybe the vice versa. But those things need to be in collaboration with manufacturing so that you can ensure that manufacturing can make the device on a regular basis in a scaled up way, not just 1Z, 2Z on a bench in the lab or in the R&D lab. Important thing is though, if you use a scale up production lot, to use it for validation, if you're blending that back over into validation, then it must be produced by manufacturing and not R&D. Once all that design validation, obviously, if you're doing simulated use testing, you're bringing people in to actually use your device. You want to have those devices produced in a manufacturing environment so they really get the device that's going to come out. So you would do that in a scale-up lot. You can't sell that lot. You can't take it to market until you pass, but that lot is being used to run those validation or simulated use testing. Then you can have your final transfer review meeting to make sure that everything on the checklist is done, that everything is ready to go. And of course, if you need approvals or clearances, to make sure you have all of those things in place as well. The formal design transfer needs to happen on a change control, using a change control process. You would officially release and transfer all the final documentation to manufacturing. And then it can be done under one change order or it can be done under multiple change orders. For instance, if you have a component that has a long lead time, you may want to transfer that into production so you can get that order started and have that time allotment to get that order in. If you don't have anything like that, sometimes it's easier to do it all in one giant change order. But that really is a decision, a kind of a business decision that you would make, but you can do it in one or more design change orders, but you need to make sure that it is change controlled when you move it over. So just a final note on changes during development and changes after design transfer. So changes during development, many of those changes can be done just using doc control, because at the end of the day, these things are documents and you can rev them and provide rationale. And most document control systems today allow you to provide all of the information you need, like why did you change and things like that. So all of that rationale is already built into the process. If that's the case, then you can actually use document control to release different versions of your development documentation, but you can only do that while you're inside development. Once you move to a production environment or after design transfer, then that formal engineering change control process needs to control all your changes to documents, drawings, specifications, and design transfer. All of that stuff comes in play after that. Obviously, if you have quality system documents, you can use the document change control process. But if you have technical documents that are related to the product or process, those things have to go through change control. So we've come to the end of our presentation. So specific questions that you didn't want to put in chat, I see that chat has been active, so you have lots of questions out there. I'm excited to get to them and to provide the answers for you. If you have very specific questions that you didn't want to share in the chat, or you have specific questions that are proprietary or confidential, that kind of thing, then please reach out to me. You can click on that, point your camera to that QR code. That will take you to my calendar link. So you can set up a call with me to discuss your individual questions. It's completely complimentary as part of coming to this workshop. I look forward to meeting each and every one of you that have attended, if I don't already know you. And with that, I will say thank you very much. That QR code link is also being put in chat from Amanda. So if you need to grab that from the chat, please do so now. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your time and attention. I hope this has been helpful for you. It's been fun for me to present this to you, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.